I appreciate you bringing me here for a behind-the-scenes tour of the New York Studio School, and it's extraordinary for me to have the opportunity to speak here tonight, and also following in the footsteps of Al Held, who spoke here in 2004, shortly before he died in 2005, and he also, I think, participated in some informal conversations in the 70s. So I feel like it's a very hospitable and favorable situation. So I'm also glad to have the opportunity to speak tonight in advance of exhibitions that will be opening up next month. There's a two-venue show that is exploring Al Held's earliest work from the 1950s, his first paintings. The first part opens at Natalie Card Gallery in Lower East Side, and that shows Al's first abstract paintings, which he created in Paris in the 50s, early 50s. The second part of the show, running mostly concurrently, is at Chime and Reid Gallery, and that explores Al's larger scale pigment paintings from the middle and late 1950s. So the way this talk is structured is somewhat of a visual biography. I joined the foundation about 18 months ago and spent a lot of time listening to Al's oral histories, reading them, and they're beautiful and eloquent and fascinating and full of telling details, but they're words on the page. So what I've been trying to do is to flesh out a lot of this this conversation, these stories, these memories that he had, and find sort of the visual cultures that Held was occupying from the early days, childhood and youth, and as a young man. And so it's going to be a little heavy on biographical, non-art images, but if you hang with me, we'll get there. And I think there's Q&A afterwards, so I'm happy to answer any questions. So hold on to them before we get started. So also just one more note that the title, Becoming Al Held, to me has a double meaning. First, it's sort of literally how Alvin Held, born working class in Brooklyn, became Al Held, the internationally renowned artist. And then also, maybe more poetically, it relates to how Held himself thought about his art. He was very clear that he was not an expressionist. He wasn't trying to put forth his own psychology or subjectivity or his moods or emotions in his painting, but in fact his paintings were somewhat separate from his own psychology and were in their own organic processes of becoming, which is a word that he used quite frequently. So, start at the beginning. Al was born in October 1928, as I said, working class Jewish family in Brooklyn. Here he is as a baby, held by his mother with his aunt nearby. The family moved several times in Brooklyn and then ended up in the Bronx in the early 1940s as his father became more successful working as a manufacturer in the jewelry business. And Held said that he had no exposure to art as a child. He had never met an artist, he didn't go to museums, he didn't even really understand that drawing could be sort of a separate human and meaningful activity. The one exposure he had to anything art-like was a portfolio of Van Gogh paintings, mass-produced, that his mother bought for $1 from a New York Post subscription sale. It was like a little bonus that they got. And I think it's interesting that Van Gogh, if you can imagine, at the time was this archetype of the struggling, starving artist, and here the image on the cover is him at his sort of the very end of his rope, and I think is almost the opposite of the kind of artist that Held end up striving to be, someone who's very professional, meticulous, and had a workmanlike approach to his career. So, but this was the one art exposure that he claimed he had. He was not interested in school. He was a truant. He took the train down to Times Square skipped school and saw the double features. He went to Grant's and got hot dogs. But movies actually ended up becoming quite important and influential for his work, not just the scale of it, but also the movement and some of the narrative elements. So World War II was happening. He was too young to join the service. It was only right after the war, at age 17, that he finally had the chance. This is in November of 1947. He said that joining the Navy was both the smartest thing and the dumbest thing that he ever did. Dumbest because there really was no good reason for him to join the Navy other than to get away from home and see the world. But the best thing because it not only saved him from being possibly drafted for Korea because he was at that age, but also it gave him the GI Bill. So we have Al as a dashing young sailor. This is one of the boats that he sailed on. It was a submarine tender. So he was on board the ship and they were provided doing salvage. He was a diver, so he wore the big helmet, 200 pounds of equipment. And everything in the early days seemed to focus on like singular things that he remembered. So he said the first book that he remembered was on boats, and sailors are famous for reading book after book and sailing and sharing their copies with each other. Somehow the fountainhead fell into his hands, and I think it's just sort of an interesting telling detail that the story of this very ambitious, controlling architect with designs for more and more space would be a story that not only Held had access to, but remembered. The politics, of course, were quite different, as we'll see. So he, after 2 years in the Navy, was honorably discharged in November of 1947. He came home, and he was, again, not sure what to do, what the next step might be. His family, I had not yet mentioned, but they were ardent left-wingers. They were socialists. As a child, he was dragged to May Day parades. They were very secular. And so this was a familiar culture for him. And then when he was in the Bronx and he was on what he called the 52-20 plan as for veterans, where for 52 weeks they got $20 a week as spending money to get them settled and reacclimated to civilian life. And some local kids, peers of his, were taking the train from the Bronx to Greenwich Village, just really around the corner from here to MacDougal Street, or MacDougal Alley, MacDougal Street, where Pete Seeger was living at the time. And he and Woody Guthrie were the center of this group called Folksay, most famous, of course, for the folk singing, but also square dancing. They were a cultural auxiliary to the socialist party and movement in the United States. And so soon enough, Held found himself going downtown initially to meet girls, but he eventually got caught up in the culture of May Day parades and floats. And this is just a sample image. He also became very active in the Henry Wallace campaign, just one who was a third-party progressive candidate running in 1948, really energized a lot, and similarly like Bernie, energized a lot of people. A couple of years ago, Wallace had the same traction with the left wing. And then all this to say that he came from a very progressive family and position which he adopted. And he started to meet artists in this at the Folksay Center, including Nick and John Krushnick, who happened to, one of them happened to be a veteran, John, and they lived one subway stop away from him in the Bronx. So he started commuting to Greenwich Village back and forth with the Krushnick brothers. They had been to the Art Students League. They introduced him to social realist painting, and that was his first introduction to art as something that was meaningful and related to his own political beliefs and would have a relationship to a community, to the people. So he started taking anatomy classes. He initially was paying for them out of his own pocket. He didn't want to use the GI Bill because he considered it to be his nest egg. It was his ticket to the future. He was thinking that he would enroll in college and become a social worker, and that would pay the bills. And in fact, he was somewhat embarrassed to be taking art classes. But he also wanted to go through it step by step, methodically, starting with anatomy, Robert Beverly Hale, Kimon Nicolaides. He studied with George Gross. To what extent, for how long, we're not sure. There's a lot of uncertainty. These are two images that I selected of work that Gross was doing at the time. Whether Held saw them, I don't know. It's just speculative, but it's painting a picture of the type of work that, of the critical left-wing work that Held was interested in. His next important mentor at the Art Students League was Harry Sternberg, who was a WPA artist. He did large post office murals. He also made these very intense emotional prints. The one on the left, which I know is hard to look at, is an image of an actual lynching which occurred in Florida in 1965, and the victim was in fact castrated. And on the right is a more recent image of the idea of the bound worker, and that Sternberg created in 1947. So the reason I selected this type of imagery was we don't know what Al was painting at the time when he was at the Art Students League. All we have are two of his verbal descriptions. So you can read it and you can see that it seems to relate very strongly with the type of work that that Sternberg was doing. Okay. Another important artist for Held was Charles White, African-American printmaker and painter who taught at the Art Students League. There's a different type of approach towards composition. There's interest in scale and monumentality. Certainly the perspective of the head on the right looking upwards relates to Held's own interest in perspective. And also the way the modeling of the figure was done quite differently by White than Sternberg. And there's a little more geometry and also higher contrast between dark and white. And then these barbed wires form this somewhat of a grid pattern. Of course, it has a narrative function within the composition, but it still also manages to add a more formal element to the composition. So again, this is all we know about another work that Held was doing at the time. Picking up, now we're also introducing Siqueiros. These are the big, blocked out, massive figures. So those of you who are familiar with Held's work, you can sort of maybe see where I'm going with all this. This is fun to show. These have never been presented to the public in any format. These are pages from a sketchbook that Held had. We don't know exactly when he did them. These are just two of quite a few, but it introduces some of the early sense of how Held approached the figure, how he approached the arrangement of forms and space. The heavily, heavily worked figure was something that he kept on returning to. The female torso also filling the entire page. It looks large, of course, on the screen. It's only 8.5 inches high, but I think following in the footsteps of White, he was able to figure out how he could bring a sense of scale and monumentality into his work without actually making it literally big. Okay, so Siqueiros becomes important as almost a non-event for Held. He had been studying the League for a number of years. He wanted to, he was ready to extend his studies. He wanted to leave the country because he felt that it was becoming a fascist state. He was living down the street from the Rosenbergs in the Lower East Side right before they were arrested. So he was very close to this community where they really felt that they were under threat from the government. And so McCarthyism wasn't just something that he read in the newspapers, but it was something that was really happening to him in his world. And Siqueiros, who was living in Mexico at the time, offered this a method of creating monumental social realist paintings, but also starting to play with that kind of the scale. And I see the relationship with the hand and the face. They occupy a similar amount of square footage on the canvas, yet through the foreshortening, the hand seems dramatically large and adds this great intensity to the image. So at the time, Siqueiros was painting a mural with the assistance of students at a school at San Miguel de Allende in Mexico. A lot of American students were there on the GI Bill. So Al hoped to go to this school and study with the great Siqueiros and realize his goal of becoming a social realist painter for the masses. But the school lost its accreditation as there was this conflict with Siqueiros. Hohlt always talked about it as being some kind of gunfight. It's probably not what happened, but Siqueiros, allegedly was involved with, an attack on Trotsky earlier. So this idea of danger and pushing the limits is something that was clearly important in this story. So this is the unfinished mural. It was recently restored, so it's probably, the lines are a lot cleaner and sharper than it was when Siqueiros left it in 1947, or 49. But also this kind of underlying structure in this large-scale mural and how space is divided and how there's narrative through time that the muralists achieved is certainly something that Hohlt was interested in later on. So without being able to go to Mexico and on the GI Bill, he looked for places to go, and he went to Paris like many, many other GIs, American GIs did. He arrived in 51, he set sail in March of 51, and his first contacts were in the same kind of communist activists, non-artists that he initially associated with in New York. And he was also going to May Day parades in Paris, and he was continuing to, in a way, pick up where he left off until he realized it became empty for him, and he committed to art. And he was taking classes at the Grand Chaumier, which was functioning very much like the Art Students League. He only mentioned two instructors who had meaning to him at that time. One was Zadkine, who's a sculptor who taught drawing at the academy, but also had his own atelier where he taught sculpture. So Hohlt was modeling little heads with clay. He also met Licia Penalba, who was an Argentinian-born sculptor, 12 years or so Al's senior, and they had a relationship, and she introduced him into a whole lot of Spanish-speaking artists from Mexico and from South America. But what he felt that he gave to her was that she was initially working in this semi-cubist style, and he told her, you should just break the limbs off of your figures, and you'll have an abstract form. So this was what Zadkine was making, and then Penalba was working more in an abstract cubist manner. He also was taking informal drawing classes with Earl Kirkham, somewhat underground legendary figure, much older generation, born in 1880. He had strong connections to a lot of the first generation artists of the New York School, Polich and de Kooning, and meeting with Kirkham and taking some drawing classes with Kirkham, Hohlt started to have this deeper familiarity with actually what was happening in New York, and was exposed more to the emergence of abstract expressionism. Having never studied art formally or art history, it was all through conversation, all through debate, that he was able to understand the history of art and the history of modernism and what was happening at the moment, what was important and what was not so. But this kind of drawing and this line, a little rough with the chalk beneath it, and outlining the figure, is something that Hohlt may have picked up from Kirkham. Again, this is very speculative. We don't know the dates of this, of these drawings, but these are in the Hohlt Foundation archive, and I'm speculating here that these are probably his last figural drawings. There may have been more of them, but these are the only three that remain. Using them, again, as a crutch to help understand images that we don't see, we don't have access to, that are lost. He was very interested in abstraction. He was exposed to Pollock. He was initially against Pollock as being a traitor to the working class for being an abstract bourgeois artist, but still, it was, as he said famously, Pollock was eating away at him. So, but he felt that before he could become an abstract artist, he had to master the multi-figure composition in a very traditional Beaux-Arts way. And so this is what he felt was his masterpiece in the the traditional definition of the term that allowed him to then progress on to becoming an artist in his own right. He met with a lot of American artists in Paris. Sam Francis became the most significant of those artists, but for him throughout the 1950s. But he also met Sal Romano, George Sugarman, Ed Clark. So that was most of the people that he socialized with, but thanks to Francis, he also was connected to Gallery Nina Dosset, which was an important hub of abstract painting in Paris. And there was a lot of critics who were passing through there, George Dutuy, Samuel Beckett, and Al allegedly attended the premiere of Waiting for Godot through this connection through Francis and the gallery and Beckett. Francis was very well established and very well accepted, so Al was, I think, grateful to have this this connection with him. So here we go back to the movies. I think of like Pauline Kael and her title, like I lost it at the movies. So there's that epiphany that he has said many times that he had. He had done his masterpiece. He was ready to become an abstract artist. He didn't know how to do it. So I don't know, I would love to know what movie it was, but somehow he figured out he would combine the objectivity of Mondrian and the subjectivity of Pollock, and that would be Held. So it sounds a little formulaic, and it was. So this is a piece that we know as Pollock Mondrian. It's the only one that's left from that series. The space is divided in a couple of basic geometric shapes, and then there's these drips and splashes within them, a little bit of staining, also some more field-type painting here. This work, I'm not sure if he considered it part of the series. It definitely leans more towards Pollock and seems to be proto-Frankenthaler, and I love these individual drips. But he was happy with how it came out, and he had his first solo show was in Paris at Galerie Wich, which was an American-run artist cooperative that was established in 1950, and so by 52, early 52, Held had his first show. And whoops, here we go, meant to do this. So all these drips look like that earlier painting we saw, and of course, by this time, Pollock was familiar to French audiences. He had just had his first solo show a month or so earlier. So I think in this case, Held was announcing himself as aligned to the New York school, even though there was still an ocean away. This is just a little image of the exterior of the gallery. Okay. So I think this is interesting. He sat for 2 weeks as a guard attending his own show and grew to hate the work. And so he felt they were too artificial, which we could see. Interesting, he wanted to bring some humanism, biomorphic organic forms, still in an abstract manner, communicating content. I mean, content is always sort of like the elephant in the room whenever you're discussing abstract work, because the official conversation always has to be formal, yet below that there is a wealth of images and associations, private meanings, public arguments that are embedded in the work. And so privately, Held was always talking about content, but publicly, form was everything. So he embarked on the series. These are also never really have been published, haven't really been studied. I find them personally to be absolutely fascinating. We call them the rock drawings. So in order to kind of go back to basics and reinvent himself as an abstract artist, he gathered these small stones and rocks that he found serendipitously around Paris. He brought them to a studio. He set them up on tables and would draw them. And we don't have any drawing that you would call, an illusionistic or realistic representation of the rock. There are always these, abstracting versions where he's operating as a middle ground between the real and the ideal or the imaginary. And I think that is a position where he was his comfort zone as an artist, where he always wanted his imagery and the content to be tethered to some sense of reality, even if it was a very convoluted and abstract reality. But at the same time, it was never going to be purely representational or purely descriptive. So I think this idea of organic form and abstraction comes across very clearly. And he made a lot of different types of these. I'm focusing on one typology that he developed through different media. We have the ink wash on the left and the gouache on the right. This is held at its most figural. This torso-like form is this truncated or fragmented human body. But then you can start seeing him playing around with color. There's pastel on the left and ink and tempera on the right. Very early examples of dealing with the challenge of laying down color and shape and having them form some sense of a complete or integrated whole, yet each have their own distinct identity. It's a sort of a conundrum or a question that he pursued throughout his entire career. But in doing all those drawings, that allowed him to then get back to what he really wanted to be doing, which was painting. So I chose all those torso-like figures in part because they allow us to see this clearly and the origins and the bridge from the rock drawings into the abstract painting. This is the only work that he did as a painting that had anything to do with that kind of torso form. This maybe suggested a little bit, but stylistically, well, actually, I should just go back. It also is a territory that he chose to stay in for a while. These very dark fields with colorful forms and regions, brushstrokes within the center, high contrast, yet very, very carefully, meticulously allowing for foreground and background and layers of paint to rise and fall as they become mixed. Also, there's a start in the use of the palette knife, which became very, very important to him throughout this period of the 50s. So internalized problems. So he's becoming a bit of a formalist now, and that's. But at the same time, with these but at the same time, he has all these very clear ideas of what the paintings meant, and he was involved in existentialism, which was all the rage in Paris in the early 50s. James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, was a book that either he read or he had a knowledge of, and so the first few words in Finnegan's Wake and the last few words of the book form one singular sentence. So the idea is that you read this book and then it just keeps going as the last sentence brings you all the way back to the beginning of the book and this endlessness of life. It's kind of a genius decision that Joyce made to transcend the limited format of the codex and try to create this timeless narrative. So Held also, as an inventive modernist, was comfortable staying within the four corners of the painted canvas, yet wanted to see how could he at least have this metaphor of endlessness by working on this horizon and showing how one could imagine, through time, one stroke leading to the next. And so there were these, obviously, these dualities between dark and light, day and night, birth and death, which he retrospectively considered to be naive and distanced himself from, but that was what was going on in his mind at the time. So these were the works that will be on view at the Natalie Carr Gallery. The next step in this body of work is to move away from overt symbolism and to focus more on gesture and to have the bands dissolve somewhat slightly into into these fields, yet still maintaining their initial sort of conceptual integrity. So what else was happening in Paris at the time? I mean, no man is an island, and the French, in addition to being quite interested in and opposed to Polich, were also putting forth some of their own, homegrown talent, and so contemporary works to what Hohlt was doing were such as Pierre Soulages, this from '53, and then Riopelle, who Hohlt in fact became somewhat friendly with in Paris. There's definitely a similarity in how they were having these very focused, short laying down of paint in this almost like a mosaic or a patchwork quality. So that was not necessarily what metaphors that they might have had, but as we see that, they're trying to resolve this tension between the all-over painting and the integrity of the individual brushstroke. All right, so also what else did Hohlt see in Paris that was meaningful to him, that we can think of him taking back with him and utilizing over the course of his career? He never studied with Léger, though Léger did take the GI Bill, and he could have, but at the time he wasn't interested in it, but he did go to the opening of the Builders and shook Léger's sweaty hand, and he must have perhaps had some memory of these architectonic forms which appear much later in Hohlt's work, also the use of the primary colors. Matisse also, Hohlt could have bought this early portfolio of jazz at the time, but he chose not to. It was expensive. He was on the GI Bill. We don't see a lot of Matisse in Hohlt's work of the 50s, but by the time 1960 rolls around, Matisse became one of Hohlt's lodestars. He went to the museums, and he described spending endless hours in the Grand Gallery, and he loved the raft of the Medusa. I mean, there was drama. He loved how the figures moved. I imagine he loved the sky and the contrast, light and dark. We also see this underlying structure that supports this, this social narrative. So the GI Bill ran out for him in early '53. He spent a couple of months traveling in Italy and Spain. Prado, he described going to see Velázquez. We don't know which ones he loved, but it was too tempting to include Las Meninas because so much of, again, the high contrast between foreground, background, deep space, and the interesting optical and psychological effects, particularly in this painting, are techniques that Hohlt explored much later in his career. So after 2 years in Paris, he was full of experiences, ideas, relationships. He came back with, I don't know exactly the code, but I'm guessing a suitcase, a box, maybe a couple of crates full of his artwork, and he was ready to join the New York School. So he was inspired to try to meet with some of his elders, learn from them. He called Mark Rothko, who was very cordial, invited him up, visited the studio. Rothko pulled out a lot of paintings. They had a conversation, took him out to dinner, and at the end of it all, Rothko said, "You really need to be with people of your own generation." And that was his advice, which at first Hohlt felt was a rejection, but in reality was excellent advice. He also sought Franz Klein, who we can see again interests, formal interests, but also Klein provided two very important lessons to Hohlt that had nothing to do with painting per se. One was where can you get a free meal during happy hour in all the different bars in New York City, so how can you survive as an artist, where he did become somewhat of a starving artist after living on a high horse and on the GI Bill in Paris, post-war Paris, but also how to mix paints. On the GI Bill, Hohlt had enough money so he can buy tubes of paint and use them quite liberally on his canvases, but he didn't have as much available to him when he was back in New York. So he began to mix his own paints, And he was painting bigger, applying more paint on the canvas. He was cooking up all sorts of different concoctions, sort of compressing a little bit of history here, where he was living in an apartment on East Broadway. At that point, he had married for the first time, and there was a house fire, or an apartment fire. Some artwork was lost, but we don't know exactly how much. But he was really living on the edge, or living, somewhat hand to mouth in this, marginal existence. And he had a daughter, got divorced, moved to Hoboken, lived in the same building as Al Leslie, was further expanding his artist networks. And after all that, decided that he wanted to move to San Francisco to get away from it all. Getting to know Sam Francis, he learned a lot about the West Coast. Clifford Still's shadow loomed large even in Paris, as many of his former students like Francis and Ernie Briggs, Ed Dugmore, spent time in Paris and were part of this expatriate scene. Hohlt lived there for about a year. It was a very formative year for him, where he met Yvonne Rainer, who was then acting and became his second wife. He also, through Rainer, met Ronnie Bladen, who became a very sculptor and a very important friend and mutual influence for Hohlt. And in terms of the Zelig-like mythology around him, which I find captivating, he also, thanks to Rainer, was in attendance at City Lights bookstore when Allen Ginsberg read Howl for the first time. So, waiting for Godot in '53 and Howl in '56. So, how much of this was he absorbing and putting into his art? I don't know, but he was on the spot. But he got tired of California. He felt that there was a lack of seriousness. People would paint one day and surf the next. He's someone who, again, grew up with no exposure to art, no opportunities, and really had chosen to dedicate his life to making art. And he couldn't understand how anyone who wanted to make art couldn't also dedicate their life, all their waking hours, to making art, thinking about art, talking about art. So the community that he was involved with in San Francisco did not embody that culture, and he chose to go back to New York. Rented a studio on 21st Street through a contact from Paris. And in this 3-year period, this is where he painted these classic pigment paintings. So here we have one example in the background, Ronald Bladen in the foreground. Rainer, of course, moved back with Hohlt, and Bladen did as well. So at this point, he was using brighter colors, greater variety of paints. He had worked at Museum of Modern Art as a custodian, so he had access to behind-the-scenes workings of MoMA. And one of the other great stories is that they were getting rid of these 100-pound sacks of pigments that they used to mix for wall paint. And so he was able to obtain these sacks because the sheer volume and quantity of paint that he needed was so enormous. I mean, he had built freeways in California. He had made cement molds, and he was part of the concrete casting and construction out there. And the sort of almost slab-like approach to laying down paint was something that he continued. So another little nugget of how he thought about his work. Now we have plenty of images. We have a lot of the painting, so we know what he was doing, roughly when he was doing it. So he's sort of entering, formal art history, and he was very aware of being a member of the New York School, but also as a younger second generation, he wanted to join 10th Street and become part of a scene that included more of his peers, such as Philip Pearlstein and Alex Katz. He met Irving Sandler, became the great critic for Hohlt and for the New York School. On 10th Street, at this point, Pollock was dead. De Kooning ruled the roost, and Hohlt started to shift his influences from Pollock to de Kooning. This fleshy pink, to me, has like de Kooning all over it. Also, the lines are starting to get a little curvier, and as Greenberg would say, has that sense of like homeless figuration within the abstraction. So, which was a road that de Kooning opened up and started to work very large. One of the big problems was working wet into wet. It was like, how do you dry the paint? There were a lot of technical challenges that he created for himself and then that he wanted to solve because of his working method. So he ended up having to consult with a lot of different chemists and others on how do you dry all the sheer quantity of pigment paint that's on this canvas. Sometimes all the paint would just slide right off the canvas in the morning, you'd find this painting on the floor. So it was just like these technical challenges. Studio assistants said that even in the 70s, these paintings were still drying. So he would cut holes in the back and let air in, but they're really extraordinary, and they have to be seen in person. So probably running out of time, but I'm just going to talk about his emergence as a artist in the 10th Street circle. The Krishnik brothers, who were important to introducing out the Art Students League, also began to support showing his work. So Camino Gallery was one of a number of artist cooperatives on 10th Street. Held had his first New York exhibition in one of these shows. It might have been this one or possibly one earlier. Quite a few familiar names on this list. We don't know what was in this show. He also showed the Tanger Gallery across the street, which was probably the more important of all the 10th Street cooperatives. Irving Sandler was the manager of the gallery. This is just an example of what the gallery looked like. We don't have any installation shots. We don't know what Held showed, but he was discussed, however briefly, in the review in the New York Times. Dory Ashton wrote, paintings of interest include a thickly painted, discrete abstraction by Al Held. So in terms of he was becoming known for these abstract paintings and then impastoed abstract paintings. The Krishnik brothers were opening a new gallery, Brata Gallery, across the street from Camino, and they asked Held if he would be, a member, and he joined, and he also brought in a lot of his friends from Paris, including George Sugarman, Julius Tobias, Edward Clark, Ronald Bladen from San Francisco. So he became a core member of the Brata Gallery, and this is where he first really emerged as a significant figure. He also had a moving business on the side to make money, and he ran it out of the Brata Gallery. I think the number, they would call this number and ask for, Held to help move art or move furniture. So the painting became more colorful, somewhat simplified in its form. There's a little more drawing that begins to emerge by the later 50s. He did not leave many writings, very few published statements. The first one was elicited by Irving Sandler in a journal called It Is, which was a gathering of abstract expressionist ideas sort of in the late 1950s. This is an excerpt. I think it's an excellent summation of like the physicality of the painting and how it was literally projected into the space of the viewer, but there also are far more, poetic and metaphorical interpretations of this idea of creating a relationship between the painting and the space that it occupies. And it's somewhat different than the idea of Robert Rauschenberg combining, art and life and bringing those together. I think for Held, it was more art and space, or art and kind of lived human experience, and how, someone will move across a painting and understand it through time, as well as through space, and more than just a simple, two-dimensional image, in the way that Clement Greenberg was advocating for that sort of that one-shot optical consciousness. He had his first Uptown show in late '58, a two-person show with the now forgotten Donald Berry, who, when I saw the images, I was surprised how much it looked like Bradley Walker Tomlin. It was kind of an interesting, it was surprising, but he was introduced to Ellie Poindexter by Milton Resnick, Mike Goldberg friends of his who were showing at Poindexter at the time. She also was showing Diebenkorn. She was on Midtown, so this was a big deal for him to get this solo show. She also perhaps invited him to join because he also had connections to European collectors. Arnold Rudlinger, who was the director of the Basel Kunsthalle, had met Held in Paris through Sam Francis. Rudlinger came on a buying trip to New York in the late 1950s, and because of this years-old relationship, came to Held's studio and bought a work for a Swiss collection. So by 1958 or so, Held was already in an important European collection, and his work was starting to be seen there as well. The work is steadily getting more geometrical. The line that he liked to say was that he wanted to be the Cézanne of abstract expressionists. He wanted to bring, structure to gesture, or make the gesture structured. So we see that through here, and then also more compellingly through this late work from 1959, and finally those geometric shapes which Held became famous for are present. The orange triangle, the yellow triangle, these stripes are also images that he kind of worked on again and again and again in drawings. But the final step for him in terms of the becoming of Al Held was in not just the discovery of this new interest in the specificity of structure and of geometry, but also the new medium of acrylic, which had been popularized a few years earlier. Again, Sam Francis is the connector, introduced Held to Liquitex. He started watering it down and using it kind of like a gouache on paper, making these much more simple, focused images. And then, perhaps this might be familiar to some of you, the major taxicab series where he had moved into Francis's studio, which was in the old Park Burnett building on Broadway by the Flatiron. So he didn't want to mess up the walls. It wasn't like one of the rat traps that he was used to working in. So he covered it with photographic background paper, and then, for reasons unknown, just kind of went wild and covered it with all sorts of new shapes, each one having its own specific identity, specific personality, jostled together, crowded together, each one kind of trying to edge each other out for primacy. But they were never shown. But this was kind of like the last major step into what became the hard-edge geometric art, which he further developed and shifted and changed over his many years of his long career. But we have, thanks to his chronologies, a really useful way to understand all of that occurred before Held became Held. And if you'll indulge me just for the minute, I'll just run through a couple of highlights of the rest of his career, and perhaps you'll see some of these anew. This was his first solo show at Poindexter. So not a brushy gestural abstraction, but a very centrally focused geometric shape with its own personality. Okay, so these are his first, we called concrete paintings. And then getting into the letter paintings, this one, Ivan the Terrible, named after the film. So he had another filmic influence. The big N, so the sense of the Securos, the big head, filling the canvas, pushing beyond space. Similar also, these problems here with Mao, one of the late, what he called letter paintings, where you just want to keep on layering and putting more into the frame, yet have flatness. And so a solution created through what he called the thou shalt nots, thou shalt not repeat a form, thou shalt not use color, and also breaking taboos of Greenberg and of formalist painting, which was against illusionism and depth. in creating these so-called three-dimensional images, further refining it, getting back into color. So all these bars, now I'm seeing echoes of Leger or even the raft. And I'm just not bringing you to the very end, but just one of his last, not last, but a major mural from '83 that was 55 feet long. And the sense of depth of space and recession. This is before he starts really bringing light into the picture, and there's many more steps in the evolution. And I think that probably that does it. So thank you everyone for your time.